In maritime history, few names resonate with the same gravity and respect as that of William Murdoch. As first officer of the RMS Titanic, his name is inscribed in the legacy of one of the most renowned ships to ever sail the oceans. Born in the small Scottish town of Dalbeattie in 1873, Murdoch followed in the footsteps of his father, a master mariner, and dedicated his life to the art of navigation. From his early days as an apprentice to his career on prestigious ships of the White Star Line, Murdoch demonstrated a combination of precision, courage, and a deep passion for the sea. His life and legacy, especially on the tragic night of April 14, 1912, continue to inspire and resonate through time. William McMaster Murdoch was born on February 28, 1873, at 3 Sunnyside, Dalbeattie, in Dumfries and Galloway, Scotland. He was the son of Captain Samuel Murdoch, a merchant marine captain, and Jane Muirhead McMaster. His birth was officially registered on March 18, 1873, at the Dalbeattie Registration Office. Murdoch's early education began at Dalbeattie Primary School on High Street, and he later attended Dalbeattie High School on Alpine Street. He was a diligent and intelligent student, excelling academically. By 1887, Murdoch had already obtained his diploma, leaving behind a reputation as a hard-working student. The Murdoch family was known for their intellectual abilities. Murdoch's sister, Margaret Elizabeth, who was his close friend and confidant, earned a master's degree from the University of Edinburgh at a time when higher education for women was uncommon. Margaret went on to become a respected school principal and was remembered for her sense of humor, generosity, and strict Victorian values. She lived until the age of 91, passing away in 1973. Murdoch's older brother, James, became a chemist, though he passed away at the age of 39 in 1906. His younger brother, Samuel, pursued a career as a merchant, working for Lockett Brothers and importing nitrate from the Atacama Desert in Chile. In school, William Murdoch showed exceptional skill in mathematics, frequently earning top marks. The Murdochs came from a long and notable line of Scottish seafarers who sailed the world's oceans since the early 19th century. Both William's father and grandfather were sea captains, as were 4 of his grandfather's brothers, so it is not surprising that William followed the family tradition. William's grandfather, Captain James Murdoch, was born on May 10, 1814, in Colvend and married Agnes Cumming on January 27, 1840. James began his maritime training in 1828. Captain James Murdoch, after a long career at sea, passed away at his home in Kipford at the age of 85 on April 17, 1900. Curiously, after Captain James Murdoch's death in 1900, 2 of his sons and 2 of his grandsons would also die at sea during the month of April. First, his son William Murdoch, also a captain, died at sea on April 4, 1906. The following year, his other son, John Murdoch, a chief officer, passed away at sea on April 10, 1907. His grandson, John Murdoch, a captain, died at sea, alongside his wife, in April 1901. Finally, William Murdoch, the first officer of the Titanic, perished at sea on April 15, 1912. William's father, Captain Samuel Murdoch, was born on April 4, 1843. Samuel served his apprenticeship alongside his father on the ship Freedom, but later became the commander of large vessels like the famous clipper Knight Companion, primarily trading between Liverpool and San Francisco. After retiring from the sea, he lived in Dalbeattie. The loss of his son William on the Titanic was a great blow from which he never recovered. He passed away a few years later. In 1864, Samuel Murdoch married Jane Jeannie Muirhead McMaster, and they had 7 children. They initially lived in Liverpool, where their first 2 children, Mary McMaster and James, were born. Later, in 1870, the family moved to Dalbeattie, Scotland, and resided at No. 3 Sunnyside, Bar Hill, in a small house where Agnes and William were born. As the family grew, Samuel built a larger house where the last 3 children were born. William Murdoch had 2 cousins born the same year as him, in 1873, James Cumming from Kipford and William Black from Palnackie. It is very likely that the 3 boys, being the same age, spent time together in the ports of Dalbeattie, Palnackie, and Kipford, discovering navigation along the River Ur. Upon finishing his education, William graduated with top honors from Dalbeattie High School in 1887. Following his family's maritime tradition, he apprenticed for 5 years with William Joyce and Company, Liverpool. After just 4 years and 4 voyages, he demonstrated such competence that he passed his second mate's certificate on his first attempt. William sailed with his uncle, Captain John Murdoch, aboard the Loch Ur, a 731-ton steel ship built in 1870. In 1888, at the age of 15, William Murdoch began his apprenticeship on the Charles Coatsworth of Liverpool, a 1,079-ton brig under the command of Captain James Kitchen. Their first destination was San Francisco, in a voyage that included the dreaded crossing of Cape Horn. It was a rigorous apprenticeship, but it gave Murdoch the determination he needed to succeed. In 1892, Murdoch left the Charles Coatsworth, and after successfully passing the second officer's certificate exam in August 1893, he embarked as second officer on the Iquiqua, a 3-masted sailing ship. The captain of this ship was none other than his father, Captain Samuel Murdoch, and together they sailed from Rotterdam to Fredrikstad, Sweden, and then on to Cape Town, Newcastle, and Iquiqua, Chile. The voyage lasted about 18 months, marking the first and last time Murdoch sailed on a ship commanded by his father. While Murdoch was an officer aboard the Iquiqua, he met another apprentice named Stanley Lord, who served on the Naiad. The two met when the Iquiqua and the Naiad coincided in the same port, and the crew of both ships visited the Iquiqua. Apparently, Lord didn't realize Murdoch's rank due to his modesty and assumed he was also an apprentice. Lord would later become the captain of the Californian, a ship that could have assisted the Titanic and Murdoch. In March 1895, Murdoch passed the exam to obtain his first officer's certificate, and starting in May 1895, he served as first officer on the St. Cuthbert. He sailed from Ipswich to Mauritius, and from there to Newport, Wales, passing through Newcastle, Callao, and Hamburg, Germany. Murdoch earned his extra master's certificate number 025780 on his first attempt in Liverpool in September 1896, at the age of 23. He was the only one of his fellow Titanic officers to pass all Board of Trade exams on the first try. The extra master's certificate was the highest qualification for a nautical officer at the time, and Murdoch achieved it in just 8 years and 2 months, which is approximately the minimum time required to obtain this license. Edward John Smith, who would later become the captain of the Titanic, and Henry Tingle Wild, who would later be the chief officer on the Titanic, failed their first attempts due to difficulties with the navigation subject. These merchant service records also note some personal details about William, such as his height, about 5 feet 9 inches or 1.75 meters, his fair complexion, brown hair, and hazel brown eyes. In April 1897, Murdoch signed a new crew agreement, joining the Lydgate, a 4-masted, 2,534-ton steel ship, as first officer. The Lydgate sailed from New York to Shanghai, then to Portland, Oregon, after that to Tientsin, China, again to Portland, Oregon, and finally to Antwerp, Belgium, where Murdoch disembarked on May 2, 1899. During the Boer War, Murdoch trained as a lieutenant in the Royal Naval Reserve, which qualified him to join the White Star Line as a steamship officer in 1899. From 1899 to 1912, William Murdoch steadily progressed from second officer to first officer, serving on various White Star Line vessels. His first assignment was on the Medic, sailing the route to Australia, alongside Charles Lightoller, the Titanic's second officer. The Medic was one of the early large luxury ships of its time, described as a steam mammoth, foreshadowing the grand luxury liners Murdoch would sail on during his career. Murdoch joined the crew on June 30, 1899, as fourth officer. By April 1900, he was promoted to third officer and served aboard the ship until June 1901. The medic was designated for the trade of Australian meat, dairy products, and fruit, equipped with state-of-the-art refrigeration machinery. However, it also had the capacity for 326 passengers. The medic departed Liverpool on August 3, arriving in Cape Town on August 23. During the voyage, the weather was favorable. After an 11.5-hour stay in Cape Town, the ship set off for Albany, where it arrived on September 8. The weather remained mostly favorable. It departed Albany on the 9th, arriving in Adelaide on the 12th. William Murdoch then served aboard the Runic as second officer. From June 1901 to June 1903, another ship on the Australian route. The year 1903 was significant for Murdoch. During a voyage of the Runic that began on February 12, 1903, William met Ada Florence Banks, a 29-year-old schoolteacher from New Zealand, on the return trip from Australia to Europe. Ada was a beautiful and lively woman, and soon they began exchanging long-distance correspondence. It was also in 1903 that William Murdoch finally reached the stormy and glamorous North Atlantic route as second officer of the new ocean liner Arabic. From June 1903 to May 24, 1904. The Arabic departed from Liverpool on its maiden voyage on June 26, 1903, bound for New York. His calm demeanor, quick thinking, and professional judgment averted disaster when a ship was spotted heading towards the Arabic in the dark. Murdoch overrode an order from his superior, Officer Fox, who had commanded a turn to starboard. He rushed to the bridge, took control from the helmsman, and kept the ship on course. The two vessels passed within inches of each other. Any change in direction would have caused a collision. Captain Jones was so impressed by Murdoch's actions that, when recounting the story, he remarked that Murdoch reacted before his eyes had even adjusted to the bridge's light and before anyone else had seen the approaching ship. Jones's final judgment of Murdoch was, there was never a better officer. Cool, capable, always alert, and with well-trained reflexes. Afterward, Murdoch became second officer of the Celtic in January 1904, and was later promoted to first officer. From May 24, 1904, to November 1904. With a gross tonnage of 21,035, the Celtic, on the Atlantic route, was the largest ship afloat in 1901 and the first of the White Star Line's Big Four. Murdoch joined the White Star Line's flagship, the Oceanic, as second officer from January 1905 to February 1906. Once again, he served alongside his friend and colleague Charles Lightoller. In October 1905, the Oceanic became the first White Star Line vessel to experience a mutiny, which, according to a New York Times article dated October 12, 1905, led to the conviction and imprisonment of 35 firemen upon the ship's arrival in Liverpool. The crew had reportedly been upset with the officers over working conditions and the standard of their accommodations. There is no concrete information regarding Second Officer Murdoch's role in this incident. However, it is interesting to note that White Star Line ships carried firearms on board, controlled by the ship's chief security officer, intended for use in cases of piracy, mutiny, or uncontrollable misconduct. It is unclear whether these were used during the mutiny. Another notable incident involving the Oceanic occurred in 1912, while Murdoch was first officer of the Titanic. The Oceanic was nearly involved in a collision when, while alongside the SS New York, the ship broke free from its moorings and almost collided with the Titanic due to the displacement caused by the Titanic's wake. In 1906, Murdoch was transferred from the Oceanic to the Cedric for 2 voyages, where he served as first officer between February and May 9, 1906. After this temporary assignment on the Cedric, Murdoch returned to the Oceanic, where he again served as second officer, though only for one voyage starting on May 9, 1906. He was then promoted to first officer on the same vessel, maintaining that rank until April 1907. In May 1907, Murdoch was appointed first officer of the company's new flagship, the Adriatic, the fourth of the Big Four, and the largest in the White Star Fleet at the time. He served under Captain Edward John Smith, who would later command the Titanic. The Adriatic sailed on its maiden voyage from Liverpool to New York, subsequently beginning White Star Line's regular transatlantic service to the United States. Murdoch remained first officer of the Adriatic until May 1911. However, Murdoch took a leave of absence during one round-trip voyage in 1907, but for a good reason. On September 2, 1907, William, 34 years old, and Ada, 33 years old, were married at St. Denis Church. After a brief honeymoon, they settled in Southampton. On September 8, 1909, William was promoted from sub-lieutenant to lieutenant in the Royal Naval Reserve. Murdoch continued to serve on the Adriatic and signed up for the next voyage in May 1911. However, on the day of sailing, he was replaced by another officer, as Murdoch was sent to Belfast to join White Star Line's newest and, once again, largest ship, the Olympic. The final stage of William Murdoch's career began in May 1911 when he joined the newly launched Olympic, a 45,000-ton liner. Designed to surpass Cunard's ships in both luxury and size, the Olympic required White Star Line's most experienced crew for large transatlantic vessels. Captain Edward J. Smith assembled a team that included Henry Tingle Wilde as chief officer, William Murdoch as first officer, and chief purser Henry McElroy. On June 14, 1911, the Olympic made its maiden voyage to New York. A photograph of the Olympic officers shows, standing, First Officer William Murdoch, Purser Hugh McElroy, Purser Claude Lancaster, Second Officer Robert Heam. Seated, Captain E.J. Smith and Dr. O'Loughlin. The first signs of trouble came on the Olympic's fifth voyage on September 20th, when it sustained serious damage to its hull after a collision with the Royal Navy cruiser HMS Hawke while leaving Southampton. Murdoch, stationed at the docking position at the ship's stern during the collision, a position of significant responsibility, was called to testify in the subsequent investigation. The incident became a financial disaster for White Star Line, as the Olympic's journey to New York had to be abandoned, and the ship was taken to Belfast for repairs, delaying its operations by 6 weeks. This also slightly postponed the construction of the Titanic. Murdoch's testimony in the inquiry regarding the Olympic and Hawke collision remained consistent with his belief that the Royal Navy was at fault. Busy at his post on the stern and lifeboat deck, Murdoch was not involved in the navigation but reacted immediately to the ship's whistle. 2 blasts in inland waters signaled a turn to starboard, which was not uncommon in the channel, but Murdoch recalled, "I looked to see what it meant." During his time as first officer aboard the Olympic, until March 1912, there were 2 other incidents, though minor. The Olympic collided with a sunken ship, which required the replacement of a broken propeller, and narrowly avoided running aground while departing Belfast. Upon arriving in Southampton, William Murdoch learned that he had been appointed chief officer of the Titanic, the Olympic's sister ship, renowned as the largest and most luxurious ship afloat. Charles Lightoller later recalled that 3 very happy men traveled north to Belfast. Murdoch was now chief officer, Lightoller was promoted to first officer, and Blair to second officer. The team was joined by other familiar faces, including Joseph Boxhall as fourth officer and, of course, the aging Captain Edward John Smith, who was approaching retirement. It was Murdoch's 5th inaugural voyage, and the 4th as a senior officer, as well as the third under the command of Edward John Smith and the second on an Olympic-class ship. At 39, William McMaster Murdoch, holding an ordinary master's certificate, and with a reputation for being a shrewd and reliable man, had risen through the ranks of the White Star Line to become one of its most distinguished senior officers. It was no surprise that he was chosen as the Titanic's chief officer, backed by 16 years of maritime experience. By late March 1912, the construction and outfitting of the Titanic were nearing completion, and the crew began gathering for sea trials. Junior officers Pittman, Boxhall, Lowe, and Moody were summoned by telegram to report to the White Star Line office in Liverpool on March 26, 1912. They were instructed to collect their tickets for Belfast, departing Liverpool that night and arriving in Belfast the next day to join the Titanic. Murdoch, as chief officer, oversaw their integration on board. The sea trials began on April 2 in Belfast's Channel and lasted less than a day. One of the key tests conducted was the main stopping test, where a buoy was dropped in the water as a reference point. After maneuvering, the Titanic was brought to full speed, and as it passed the buoy, it was ordered to go full reverse. Murdoch and junior officer Moody carefully observed the buoy's position with sextants and reported their measurements to Edward Wilding, who signaled Captain Smith. The command to reverse was given, and the massive ship trembled as the engines reversed at full power. Traveling at 20 knots, the Titanic took just under half a mile, around 800 meters, to come to a complete stop. With all the tests meeting the standards of the Board of Trade, the Titanic set sail that same night at 8 p.m. bound for Southampton, its port of embarkation, arriving on April 3 to begin provisioning and staffing for its maiden voyage. A few days before the departure date, there was a surprising announcement. At the last moment, Captain Smith reorganized the command staff positions to accommodate Henry Tingle Wilde as chief officer. Since the Olympic was in dry dock, the White Star Line's senior management thought it would be a good idea to send the Olympic's chief officer, just for that voyage, as chief officer of the Titanic, to help with his experience on the sister ship. This meant that Murdoch was demoted to the position of first officer, Charles Herbert Lightoller to second officer, while David Blair was left out entirely and had to disembark, with the other officers remaining the same. One can imagine Murdoch's disappointment at his demotion in rank. In a letter to his sister, written on April 8, 1912, 2 days before sailing, while his wife Ada was being given a tour of the new ship, he wrote, "I am still chief officer until sailing day, and then it seems I will have to step back to first officer, so I hope it won't be for too long." The chief marine superintendent of Liverpool seemed very impressed and pleased that everything was in order, and he promised that when Wilde leaves, I will be promoted again. Murdoch's demotion also meant a decrease in his salary, from £25 to £17. The crew agreement document of the Titanic, with the signatures of Captain Smith and his officers. According to Robert Hitchens, the helmsman of the Titanic, William Murdoch called out the names of the crew on the day they assembled in Southampton. The new chief officer, Henry Tingle Wilde, came on board on April 9, after the coal supply, crew recruitment, loading, and food supply were completed. The 10th of April 1912, at around 12 noon, the senior officers Wilde, Murdoch, and Lightoller presented their reports to the captain. First Officer Murdoch reported that the ship was ready to sail. The crew groups were fully manned and ready at the moorings. First Officer Murdoch was in his former position at the stern, supervising the handling of the mooring lines and the tugboat's ropes by the boatswain and his men. Third Officer Pittman, on the mooring bridge, transmitted instructions to Murdoch in response to the telegraphic orders from the bridge. Like aboard the Olympic, Murdoch also witnessed the powerful effect of these new, large luxury liners. As previously mentioned, while the Titanic was navigating the river test, the displacement of water caused the 6 mooring lines of the New York to snap, bringing its stern close to the Titanic. A quick intervention avoided a collision by only 4 feet. For Murdoch, it must have felt like déjà vu. Unfortunately, this was just a prelude to what was to come. Although the incident delayed the Titanic's departure by about an hour, the Titanic arrived 4 hours later, at 6:35 p.m., at the French port of Cherbourg. Due to the size of the Titanic and the lack of adequate docking facilities in Cherbourg, the White Star Line operated 2 tenders, the SS Traffic and the SS Nomadic. Within 90 minutes, 274 passengers boarded the Titanic, and 24 disembarked. It was on the traffic tender where an incident related to Murdoch occurred. According to a young Frenchman named Jules Munch, First Officer Murdoch temporarily prohibited a French naval officer, Commander Leloup, from boarding the Titanic. This order was later overturned by Captain Smith, allowing Munch and Commander Leloup to make a personal visit to the Titanic. Commander Leloup of the French Navy wanted to take the traffic to visit the Titanic. After missing the departure, he boarded the traffic. Murdoch denied him access. In fact, Lieutenant Murdoch disobeyed an important maritime regulation by prohibiting a French officer from entering the ship. Captain Smith was called, and he personally came to pick up Commander Leloup at the dock. Finally, at 8:10 p.m., the Titanic departed from Cherbourg bound for Queenstown, arriving at 11:30 a.m. on Thursday, April 11th, at the port of Cork, on the southern coast of Ireland. Once again, the docking facilities were insufficient for a ship the size of the Titanic, so auxiliary boats were used to transfer 113 third-class passengers and 7 second-class passengers on board, while 7 passengers disembarked. Here, the last known photograph of the asterisk Titanic crew was taken, in which Lightoller and Murdoch prepared to close the pier before departing from Queenstown. It is the last photograph in which Murdoch or any officer of the asterisk Titanic is seen in service. Interestingly, this photograph reveals that Lightoller apparently still wears the stripes of First Officer, 2 stripes, which would also indicate, although not clearly visible in the image, that Murdoch would wear the stripes of Chief Officer, 3 stripes. This raises the real possibility that, although their ranks changed due to the last-minute switch, their uniforms had not been updated, causing confusion among the crew and passengers. This would explain the subsequent confusions where Murdoch was still referred to as Chief Officer. The Titanic lifted anchor for the last time at 1:30 p.m. and departed from Queenstown on its westward journey across the Atlantic. After leaving Queenstown, Mr. Murdoch drafted a list of lifeboats, assigning officers to their different positions in the boats, and also prepared an emergency list. On Sunday, April 14, 1912, they were in the 4th day of the Titanic's first transatlantic voyage. The weather had been clear and pleasant, and progress had been good. Ice warnings had been received, which was not unusual for April crossings. But the captain maintained good speed, slightly altering the ship's course to the southwest of the normal route, possibly as a precaution to avoid an ice field expected to be reached around midnight. Murdoch was aware of these ice warnings. Lunch was served at 12:30. Second Officer Lightoller relieved Chief Officer Wilde during lunch, who returned to the bridge around 1 o'clock or a few minutes later while Lightoller took his lunch. At that moment, Captain Smith arrived on the bridge with a message, a marconigram, and asked Lightoller to read it. After reading the message, Lightoller mentioned the ice warning to Murdoch when he returned to the bridge. Although Lightoller suspected that the information might have been new to Murdoch, he could not confirm it with certainty due to the lack of a clear expression from the first officer. At 7:15 p.m., the lamp trimmer man Samuel Hemming arrived on the bridge to report that all of the ship's navigation lights were on. Finding that Lightoller had gone to the office's dining room for dinner and that First Officer Murdoch was temporarily in charge, Hemming received instructions from Murdoch to ensure that the forward hatch was closed as he moved toward the bow. This was because the ship was in an area close to icebergs, and there was a glow coming from the hatch that could interfere with visibility, making it difficult to detect potential obstacles in the path. Hemming went forward and personally closed the hatch before going below. At 7:35 p.m., when Second Officer Lightoller returned to the bridge after dinner, he noticed that the temperature had dropped rapidly since he had gone to dinner. Murdoch commented that the temperature had fallen 4 degrees in the half-hour Lightoller had been away, reaching 4 degrees. An hour later, the temperature was almost at freezing. At 10 p.m., the 4 bells indicated the change of watch in the 4-hour shifts. Murdoch's watch was from 10 p.m. to 2 a.m. As the officer of the watch, each of the 3 senior officers has a shift in charge of the ship, rotating in 4-hour shifts every 12 hours. Wild from 2 a.m. to 6 a.m. and 2 p.m. to 6 p.m. Murdoch from 10 a.m. to 2 p.m. and 10 p.m. to 2 a.m. and Lightoller from 6 a.m. to 10 a.m. and 6 p.m. to 10 p.m. Along with First Officer Murdoch, who relieved Second Officer Lightoller on the bridge, the new lookouts Fleet and Lee took the watch from Jewel and Hogg. Before handing over the watch to Murdoch, Lightoller reported that they were sailing on a course of 71 degrees west. Murdoch noted that the weather was quite cold and that he was wearing a coat to protect himself from the frigid air. Lightoller confirmed that the weather was indeed freezing, with an air temperature of 0 degrees Celsius. As Murdoch adjusted to the darkness, the two talked about the clear weather and how far they could see, observing the stars approaching the horizon. Lightoller mentioned that they would likely be near the ice around 11 o'clock. He also described Captain Smith's earlier visit to the bridge and his desire to be notified if any doubts about the situation arose. Finally, he informed Murdoch about the orders he had given to the lookouts in the crow's nest to keep a sharp lookout. The ship's telegraphs were set to full speed, running at 75 to 78 revolutions or between 22 and 22.5 knots. Around 11:30 p.m., lookouts Fleet and Lee noticed a slight haze directly in front of the Titanic. But it wasn't until 11:40 p.m. that Frederick Fleet spotted an iceberg directly ahead, approximately 500 meters away and towering about 16 meters above the water. Immediately, the warning bell sounded with 3 sharp rings, and he communicated by telephone with the bridge. Sixth Officer Moody answered the phone. Fleet quickly reported the presence of the iceberg, to which Moody acknowledged and hung up the phone. He then relayed the warning to Murdoch, urgently indicating the imminent threat. There was an iceberg directly in the ship's path. There are differing opinions on whether Murdoch, on the starboard bridge, saw the iceberg before or after Moody received Fleet's call. Some suggest that he may not have seen it at all. However, he likely heard the 3 bells of the warning bell from the starboard wing of the bridge, drawing his attention to the obstacle, which would have provided him with the visual information needed for his subsequent orders. Despite the seriousness of the situation, Murdoch's response was immediate and instinctive. He moved to the closed navigation bridge and ordered helmsman Hitchens to put the wheel hard to starboard. According to 4th Officer Boxhall, Murdoch also ordered that the engine telegraphs be set to stop and then to full astern. After what must have felt like an eternity, the Titanic began to turn to port. The lookouts watched helplessly as the iceberg approached and finally struck the starboard bow, grazing the side of the ship. According to 4th Officer Alfred Oliver, when the iceberg passed midship, Murdoch ordered the wheel hard to port, intending to swing the stern away from the iceberg. In this, Murdoch is successful. He has also avoided a head-on collision, but what results is a much more lethal impact. Below the waterline, The iceberg scrapes the hull of the Titanic, denting the plates, popping rivets, and causing enough damage to flood the first 5 watertight compartments. Based on the mathematical certainty that if more than 4 are breached, water will flood the next compartment, and so on, the Titanic is destined to sink, but gradually over the next few hours. Then, Murdoch heads to the switch that electrically activates the watertight doors. By doing so, he activates a hydraulic system that automatically lowers the watertight doors in the engine and boiler rooms. Within 15 seconds of pulling the emergency lever, the doors to the lower compartments close. Depending on their location aboard the ship, some are jolted by the impact, while others remain completely unaware of what has just occurred. One person awakened by the collision is Captain Smith, who quickly rushes to the bridge within a minute. Captain Smith arrives at the bridge and asks what has happened. First Officer Murdoch informs him that the ship has struck an iceberg. He explains that he ordered the helm to starboard and instructed the engines to reverse, in addition to attempting to maneuver to avoid the iceberg, but it was too late, and the impact could not be avoided. After a brief exchange, Captain Smith steps out onto the starboard wing of the bridge to look toward the stern. Murdoch and Boxhall follow him. The 3 officers stand for a moment in the darkness. Boxhall thinks he may have seen a dark shape in the distance, but he is not sure. At 12:20, 20 minutes after the crash, Captain Smith ordered Chief Officer Wilde to uncover the lifeboats and instructed Murdoch to gather the passengers and crew at their lifeboat stations. Murdoch did so in the most efficient and logical manner possible. He gathered the deck stewards, who were to alert the passengers under their responsibility. These 2 officers were in charge of launching the lifeboats. Wilde supervised the starboard side, with Second Officer Lightoller assisting, while Murdoch oversaw the port side, assisted by Officers Lowe, Pittman, and Moody. Murdoch supervised the work of the sailors, who uncovered and prepared the lifeboats in approximately 20 minutes following his orders. Lifeboats 3, 5, and 7 were turned out in order, with Murdoch maintaining the priority of women and children boarding. Unlike Murdoch, Lightoller was stricter in not allowing men to board the lifeboats, which caused the evacuation on the port side to be slower. Additionally, the slight tilt of the ship toward starboard contributed to the lifeboats on Murdoch's side being launched more quickly. On the starboard side, First Officer Murdoch was more flexible, allowing men to board the lifeboats if there was available space. Captain Smith ordered the lifeboats to be loaded around 12:25 a.m., and Murdoch was very active in the evacuation process. At 12:40, on the foredeck, Murdoch was supervising the preparation of Lifeboat 7 on the starboard side. The lookout G.A. Hogg testified that as he passed by Lifeboat No. 7, Murdoch instructed him to ensure that the plugs were securely placed in the boat. Hogg checked that everything was in order, reported back to Murdoch, and then assisted with the ropes. After doing so, Murdoch instructed him to board the boat, which Hogg complied with while Murdoch and Sailor Evans took care of lowering the lifeboat. William Thompson Sloper, a first-class passenger aboard the Titanic, recalled being on deck with other passengers, adjusting their life jackets and listening to the sound of steam. Murdoch informed the passengers through a megaphone that they could board the lifeboat without worry, as the sea was calm, and they would be picked up later after assessing the damage to the ship. Murdoch delivered this information calmly, following Captain Smith's policies aimed at preventing any panic. Despite the situation, some passengers decided to board the boat with the help of Murdoch and his crew, while others, by their own choice, opted to stay on the ship, feeling safer at first. There was no disorder or pushing, as the passengers behaved in a calm and controlled manner, displaying admirable serenity in the midst of the disaster. Third Officer Pittman assisted him in the operation. Murdoch called out to nearby passengers, inviting women to board. However, no one responded, as few wanted to leave the apparent safety of the Titanic to get into a small boat in the middle of the Atlantic. Lifeboat 7, the first to be lowered that night under Murdoch's orders, had 32 occupants, 3 crew members, 13 women, and 19 men, mostly from first class. Among the crew were lookouts Hogg and Jewell, and sailor William Weller. Notable survivors among the passengers included actress Dorothy Gibson. Working under Murdoch's orders, 3rd Officer Herbert Pidman was preparing lifeboat number 5 for lowering at 12:43 a.m. He allowed a few more men to board until the boat had about 40 occupants, even though its capacity was 65. Pidman then jumped from the boat onto the deck to assist in the lowering process, leaving Quartermaster Alfred Oliver in charge. At that moment, Murdoch approached Pidman and instructed him to take charge of the lifeboat. The two shook hands, and Murdoch wished Pidman luck as he climbed back into the boat. Although Pidman did not believe the ship would sink, he suddenly realized that Murdoch thought otherwise. White Star Line's president, Bruce Ismay, assisted in loading and lowering lifeboat No. 5, though 5th Officer Lowe became frustrated with his interference and asked him to step aside so he could work. While Murdoch was known to allow some men to board the lifeboats he was launching, in the case of No. 5, a stout man bent down to kiss his wife and accidentally fell into the boat along with her. Murdoch immediately ordered the man to be removed from the lifeboat. Finally, Dr. H.W. Frauenthal, a first-class passenger, decided to join his wife in the boat, and he and his brother jumped into the lifeboat while it was being lowered. This caused Mrs. Annie Mae Stengel, who was already in the boat, to suffer a dislocation of 2 ribs and lose consciousness. At 12:55 a.m., Murdoch was overseeing lifeboat number 3, which had between 38 and 40 people aboard, including 26 male passengers and 13 crew members, 10 of whom were firemen. Space was given to the men as there were not enough women willing to board. Murdoch ordered the boat to be launched at 1 a.m. and placed Able Seaman Moore in charge, instructing him to board the boat and assist with helping the women on board. The next lifeboat was the number 1, containing only a dozen people, making it the least crowded of all the lifeboats launched that night. By the time Lifeboat 1 was being filled, the bow of the Titanic had already sunk deeper into the water. This led most passengers to head towards the stern, believing it to be the safest place. As a result, Murdoch had some difficulty finding passengers to fill Lifeboat 1. The Duff Gordons and their maid boarded the boat. Then, 2 American gentlemen approached and asked if they could also board, and Murdoch allowed them to do so. One of these men was quite large and struggled to get into the boat. Finally, he simply climbed over the railing and rolled into the lifeboat. Murdoch, who witnessed the scene, laughed heartily and exclaimed, "That's the funniest thing I've seen tonight," according to the survivor. This incident reflects Murdoch's good sense of humor, which he had not lost even during one of the worst moments of his life. However, he may still have been hoping that the nearby ship, which many believed to be coming, would arrive in time, possibly easing the situation for him. As awareness of the Titanic's sinking increased and with limited seats in the lifeboats, crowd control became an issue. Around 1:15 a.m., senior officers made the decision to have revolvers ready in case crowds began rushing toward the lifeboats. At 1:30 a.m., the Titanic had developed a noticeable list to starboard, and the incline of the stern had become more pronounced. Lifeboat 9 was prepared with the help of 6th Officer James Moody, lowered to the edge of the deck, and nearly filled to capacity, including 2 or 3 men who entered the boat when no more women approached. Boarding was interrupted when an elderly woman caused a commotion, refusing to board and walking back inside the ship, despite the crew's best efforts to assist her. The ship's tilt caused a French lady to fall and injure herself while attempting to board the lifeboat, prompting Chief Purser Hugh McElroy to place 3 men in the boat to help bridge the growing gap between the lifeboat and the ship. Millionaire Benjamin Guggenheim escorted his French mistress Léontine Abad and her maid Emma Sagasser to lifeboat number 9 before retreating to his cabin with his valet Victor Giglio, both of whom perished in the disaster. As the gravity of the situation became more evident, Murdoch started filling lifeboats with more people than before. Around 1:35 a.m., Murdoch was in front of lifeboat number 11, filled from deck A, was overloaded with at least 5 more people than its capacity, cramming around 70 passengers on board, more than any other lifeboat. When it reached the water, the boat was nearly swamped by a stream of water gushing from the ship's pump discharge. Boatswain Humphreys and Seaman Bryce joined the boat via ropes when they realized there were no sailors aboard to help. Murdoch quickly turned his attention to lifeboats number 13 and 15, intending to fill and lower them simultaneously. Lifeboat 13 was also lowered to deck A, where women and children from second and third class were boarded first. Afterward, men were allowed to board, including Lawrence Beasley, a second-class teacher. Beasley recalled Murdoch giving clear instructions to the crew of Lifeboat 13 to row towards the open gangway door once they were in the water and await further orders. At approximately 1:41 a.m., around 30 seconds after Lifeboat 13 was lowered, Murdoch, assisted by 6th Officer Moody, ordered the launch of Lifeboat 15, with around 70 people on board. It seems that Murdoch faced multiple challenges regarding crowd control and loading lifeboats, which may have contributed to his being unaware of the critical situation unfolding below as Lifeboat 15 was being lowered. Murdoch narrowly avoided a chaotic attempt to board the boat, shouting at the crowd, "Back! Back! Women first!" while holding a revolver in hand, signaling the seriousness of the situation. Even though many crew members still did not fully grasp the magnitude of the disaster. These accounts highlight the intense pressure Murdoch was under, struggling to maintain control in a rapidly deteriorating situation while attempting to save as many people as possible. However, while trying to disengage the lowering ropes, Lifeboat 13 drifted dangerously beneath Lifeboat 15, which was descending right on top of them. Thanks to the quick actions of Murdoch and his team, the descent of Lifeboat 15 was halted in time, allowing the crew of Lifeboat 13 to free themselves and row to safety. Around 2 a.m., with only the 2 collapsible lifeboats remaining on the starboard side, Murdoch briefly crossed over to the port side to check the progress and assist with the loading of lifeboat number 10. Milvina Dean, who would later become the last living survivor of the Titanic disaster, passing away at age 97 in 2009, was just 9 weeks old at the time. She, along with her mother Georgetta, all survived by boarding Lifeboat 10. Returning quickly to the front of the starboard boat deck, Murdoch prepared to launch collapsible Lifeboat C, which featured a flat wooden bottom with canvas sides that could be raised and assembled. The launch of Collapsible C became the scene of significant drama. One notable incident involved Albert V Perky, a steward, whom Murdoch ordered into the collapsible boat to care for 2 infants already aboard. A crowd began pushing and surging, trying to board the boat, and 2 men fell inside. Murdoch fired 3 warning shots into the air, shouting commands to clear the area. Hugh Woolner and Bjornstrom Stephenson, drawn by the flashes of gunfire, rushed over to assist. They dragged the intruders out of the boat, pulling them by their arms or legs, clearing the collapsible for the rest of the boarding process to continue. Shortly after these men were forcibly removed, another man managed to board the boat. Bruce Ismay, president of the White Star Line, who was traveling as a first-class passenger. When no further women or children stepped forward, Ismay entered the boat just as it began to lower. Murdoch, who was present, remained silent. After Ismay boarded, Murdoch gestured to the sailors to continue lowering Collapsible C. Most of the crowd had moved toward the stern, realizing that most of the boats at the bow had already departed. At this point, the exact details of the events become unclear due to the chaos and confusion as the Titanic enters its final moments. As the ship tilts further into the sea and water rises toward the forward lifeboat deck, a group of men desperately struggles with collapsible lifeboat A, trying to lower it from a davit. The collapsible lifeboats A and B were stored on the roof of the office's quarters, on either side of the forward funnel. They were in an inaccessible place, and there was no mechanism to lower them. However, Murdoch led a small group to the roof, and the boat was maneuvered to the edge, where oars were placed to slide it down to the boat deck.
Antes de que pudieran cargarlo, el extremo delantero de la cubierta de los botes desapareció bajo el agua y, aún sujeto a los pescantes, el bote comenzó a alejarse.
The ropes were quickly cut by steward Edward Brown and another man who jumped into the boat, although by then a wave had already flooded it. Murdoch was seen trying to untangle or cut the forward ropes, lines, pulleys, of lifeboat number 1 to use them to lower collapsible A as he straightened the forward ropes. Murdoch signaled those present to move further away from the tilting deck. The sea overtook them, and collapsible A was left floating on the davits until it was released. After the Titanic sank into the Atlantic in the early hours of April 15, 1912, First Officer William Murdoch was never seen again. It is believed he drowned, as his body was never recovered. In the final moments of the Titanic, William McMaster Murdoch showed unwavering heroism. Nearly 75% of the people who managed to escape in lifeboats that tragic night owed their lives to Murdoch. His experience and ability to remain calm under unbearable pressure saved hundreds of lives, with approximately 61% of the survivors being in lifeboats that he either supervised or helped load. Murdoch was a key figure in managing the chaos on board, organizing the lowering of lifeboats, maintaining control in panic situations, and always prioritizing the safety of passengers, especially women and children. Despite the increasing disorder and the imminent catastrophe, Murdoch kept his composure, leading with courage. In his final moments, Murdoch not only fulfilled his duty but acted as a true hero. His dedication and sacrifice during the sinking of the Titanic left a legacy of bravery and humanity, forever remembered as one of the great unsung heroes of that fateful night.